Today, we're diving into a story where the line between a writer's dark imagination and a real-life murder just completely vanished.
I mean, it's a wild question, right? But it is at the absolute heart of this unbelievable true story. It's about a writer who put her darkest ideas down on paper, years before she turned them into an actual crime scene. So, let's set the scene. At the center of all this are two people, Nancy Crampton Brophy, a romance novelist, and her husband of nearly 25 years, Dan Brophy, who is a celebrated chef and culinary instructor. And on the surface, they really seem to have this picture-perfect marriage. Nancy would even say that she drew inspiration from their life for her romance novels. Her books were always full of these powerful women, strength, love, and they always had a happy ending, because she truly believed she was living one was Dan.
A huge part of what made them work, or so it seemed, was their independence. Nancy really valued her freedom, and she'd spend hours and hours writing up in their attic. And Dan? He was just as obsessed with his own world of food, teaching, raising chickens, foraging for mushrooms, you name it. They gave each other the space to just be themselves.
But that perfect picture, it had some serious cracks. They were drowning in credit card debt. I'm talking about the almost losing their home kind of debt. It got so bad that Dan actually had to pick up a second, much less glamorous cooking job just to try and make ends meet. The financial pressure was really building.
And all that pressure was about to explode into an act of violence that looked, for all the world, like it was completely unsolvable.
Okay, so picture this. The morning of June 2nd, 2018. Everything seems totally normal. Dan leaves early for his job at the Culinary Institute. Nancy, who said she was struggling with her latest novel, goes for a drive to clear her head. But a little after 7:30 in the morning, when Dan's students show up for class, they find him. He's on the kitchen floor, shot twice.
For the police, this was an absolute nightmare from the get-go. They had nothing. No witnesses, no signs of a fight, nothing was stolen, and the security cameras at the school? Totally useless. The crime scene was a complete mystery.
So, with no leads, the investigation naturally turns to Dan's wife, Nancy, who, for all intents and purposes, appeared to be a devastated, grieving widow who was just desperate for answers. And this became the big question, right? Nancy seemed just as confused as the investigators. By all accounts, Dan was a beloved chef. Who on earth would want to kill him?
And Nancy, well, she had a few ideas. She pointed out that Dan's tough teaching style had gotten him into trouble before. She mentioned he did work with the homeless community, and she suggested maybe he'd cross paths with someone dangerous. She basically painted this picture of a guy whose gruff personality could have easily made him a target. And you know what? It worked. For 2 long months, the case went absolutely nowhere. Publicly, Nancy's world was just falling apart. She was facing foreclosure. She seemed totally overwhelmed with grief. She looked every bit the tragic victim.
But just when it seemed like this case was destined to become another cold file, investigators found a ghost in the machine. A clue so bizarre, it felt like it was ripped straight out of one of Nancy's own novels.
So it's 2 months to the day after Dan's death, and detectives show up in Nancy's driveway. They tell her there's been a huge break in the case, and that they found something on the internet that pointed directly to the killer.
It was the title of a blog post, a post written by Nancy herself.
Okay, so let's back up. This wasn't something she wrote last week. This was an essay she had written for a writing blog all the way back in 2011, 7 years before the murder. In it, she kind of muses about motives, like financial gain, or maybe ending abuse. And she talks about methods. She even noted that a writer who thinks about murder needs to be organized, ruthless, and very clever.
For the investigators, this was just a jaw-dropping realization. It was like the killer had been workshopping their crime for years, leaving this confession hidden in plain sight the entire time.
This one discovery changed everything. It was the key that unlocked how a writer of romance could become the villain in her own real-life thriller.
And all of a sudden, her self-published books took on this chilling new meaning. They were filled with these strong female characters who weren't afraid to, eliminate their enemies. It just raises this really disturbing question. When you spend years writing about murder, does it start to feel like just another plot point? Does that line between you and your characters start to blur?
So what was the real motive here? Well, it turned out to be a cold, calculated plot for profit. They were financially ruined, sure,
but Dan had a ton of life insurance. And for Nancy, that massive payout was her one-way ticket to her lifelong dream, becoming a full-time, financially stable author.
In the end, this was a story of two competing passions. By all accounts, Nancy really did love her husband, but there was maybe something she loved more: the idea of being a writer. That ambition, that all-consuming desire for a life funded by her own words, it won. It wasn't just about escaping debt, it was about financing her dream. In the story she was writing for herself, her husband, well, he just became a disposable character.
Nancy Crampton Brophy was found guilty of murdering her husband. The writer who fantasized about the perfect crime was ultimately sentenced to life in prison.
And it just leaves us with this deeply unsettling question. For a writer, exploring dark thoughts is part of the job description. But in this case, those thoughts just bled right off the page and into reality. So where do you draw that line? Where does a creative fantasy end and a criminal blueprint begin?